A foreman looked me dead in the eye and said, "Nobody leaves this site during lunch. Not one person. You eat here, you don't eat." I nodded, said understood, and pulled out my phone to send myself an email, because I already knew exactly how this was going to end. Let me back up and explain why that rule was one of the dumbest things I'd heard in 22 years of construction work. My name is Marcus. I'm 41 years old. I'm a licensed civil engineer with 2 decades of site experience, and at the time of this story, I was the senior project coordinator on a commercial build in the north end of the city. The project was a 4-story mixed-use development called the Harlow Block. The general contractor was a mid-sized firm called Pinnacle Build Group. Contract value, $14.2 million. Scheduled completion, second Friday in March, and we were on track to hit it. Hold those numbers in your head. $14.2 million. On track. Now let me tell you about the foreman. Dale Pruitt was 47 years old, 12 years at Pinnacle, and the kind of guy who confused being loud with being in charge. He hadn't worked a full trade role since his mid-30s. He moved into supervision early, which is fine. The problem was Dale had convinced himself he moved up, because he was smarter than everyone around him. He wasn't. He was confident. There's a difference. Dale had a habit. Every few months he'd roll out a new site rule. He always framed them as efficiency measures. What they actually were was Dale reminding everyone that he was the foreman, and they had to do what he said. The rules almost never connected to any real problem on site. Most of the time they were annoying but harmless, no personal music devices on the second floor, all hand tools returned to the staging area at shift end. Sign the materials log in blue ink only, not black. Blue ink only. I'm not making that up. Now here's the situation on the Harlow Block as of the 3rd week in January. We had roughly 85 workers on site across multiple subcontractors: electrical, plumbing, drywall, framing, concrete finishing. The site sat in an industrial corridor on the north end of the city, which meant the nearest food was a strip of restaurants about a 7-minute drive away. A sandwich place, a taco truck that parked in the same spot every weekday, a gas station deli counter, and a burger place that moved fast if you kept your order simple. The contracted lunch break was 45 minutes. Unpaid. Mandatory. For at least 18 months before any of this, the crew had a system that worked perfectly. A handful of guys with trucks did a food run. Everyone chipped in their orders and cash in the morning. The drivers left around 11:50, were back by 12:10, and everyone ate comfortably before the 12:30 restart. Workers were fed, back on time. 0 issues. There was no food vendor on site. Pinnacle had considered setting one up and never did. No vending machines either, just a water cooler and a coffee urn. So when Dale announced his new rule on a Monday morning in the 3rd week of January, nobody leaves the site during the lunch window. Starting today, no exceptions. I did the math in my head in about 4 seconds. 85 workers. No food on site. 45-minute break. January, so cold. Workers who are hungry and cold with nothing to do for 45 minutes. This was going to be a disaster. My job as project coordinator wasn't exactly to manage the foreman, but it wasn't not my job either. I was the person responsible for keeping the project on schedule and flagging risks. A foreman decision that was going to hit crew morale, energy, and afternoon productivity was absolutely in my lane. So I went to Dale that same Monday morning, about an hour after his announcement. I told him I wanted to talk through the lunch rule. He didn't look up from his clipboard, already decided. I laid it out for him anyway. No food on site. The existing food run system works and keeps everyone back on time. Kill the run and workers either go hungry or eat whatever they happen to bring. In January, cold, tired. We're in the final push to a March deadline, and we can't afford an afternoon productivity hit. Dale looked up then. His exact words. Then they should bring food from home like adults. I told him some of them do, but not all 85, and the ones who rely on the run aren't going to start packing lunches overnight. He said, that's their problem. I tried one more angle. I asked him what problem the rule was actually solving. He straightened up and gave me the look, the one that meant I was stepping on his authority. He said he'd had guys taking 90-minute lunches, and he was done with it. Rule is the rule. Nobody leaves. I said, okay, I'd like that in writing. He stared at me for a second. Then he said he'd send an email to the whole team that afternoon. I said, thanks, Dale. That email arrived at 3:42 p.m. I read it, forwarded it to myself with a subject line that read, Dale Pruitt Site Rule Re, Lunch Break 01/20, and saved it in a folder I labeled Harlow Block Foreman Directives. Then I opened a new Word document. Date, time, observation, consequence. Simple daily log. I'd done it before on complicated sites. Call it habit. I also sent one more email that afternoon, just to Dale, copied to nobody, short and professional. I confirmed receipt of his directive, restated my concern about afternoon productivity without an on-site food option, flagged it as a potential project risk, and offered to help coordinate a lunch vendor if that would solve the underlying problem. Dale replied 11 minutes later, noted, rule stands. I saved that too. Then I did exactly what he said. I followed the rule, to the letter. I did not organize an alternative. I did not quietly tell the crew to ignore it. I did not escalate to upper management. I did not set up a food vendor on my own. He had a clear directive. I had flagged the risk in writing, and now I was going to comply fully, completely, and document everything that happened next. The first week was rough, but not catastrophic. The crew grumbled constantly. The food run drivers, 3 guys named Eddie, Santos, and Carver, told me Monday afternoon that Dale had personally told them their trucks weren't moving during lunch. Eddie in particular was unhappy. He was the informal leader of the framing crew and had a lot of sway with the guys. I told him Dale's the foreman, and the rule is the rule. Eddie looked at me like I'd grown a second head, then shrugged and went back to work. By Wednesday of that first week, I was logging real effects. 3 workers from the electrical subcontractor, a company called Faro Electric, told their supervisor Glenn that they were going to start taking informal personal breaks in the afternoon because they weren't eating at lunch and couldn't sustain 5 hours of physical labor on nothing. Glenn passed that to me in conversation. I put it in the log. Wednesday, January 22nd. Faro Electric crew, reporting afternoon productivity impact due to lunch restriction. By Friday of week 1, the afternoon output numbers I was tracking against our schedule showed a dip. About 6% slowdown in drywall installation on floors 2 and 3. 6% doesn't sound like much. On a project this size, a sustained 6% slowdown adds up to real schedule slippage over multiple weeks. I put it in the log and kept going. Week 2 is where things started compounding. On Tuesday, January 28th, Dale did something I hadn't anticipated. He decided to enforce the rule more aggressively. He'd noticed a few guys sneaking to their trucks and eating meals they'd stashed in their cabs. The trucks were parked in the adjacent lot, which was technically off the active site. Dale decided the lot counted as part of the site for purposes of his rule. He walked through the lot at 12:10 and ordered 4 guys to get back to the break area inside the fence. Those 4 guys were from a concrete finishing subcontractor called Belmont Concrete. They'd been on site 3 weeks and were scheduled for 4 more. Next morning, the Belmont site supervisor, a guy named Phil, called me directly. His crew was not happy. Eating in your truck is standard practice in construction. Dale's enforcement in a parking lot wasn't covered by any contract language Phil was aware of, and he wanted to know what to do. I told him I agreed with his read of it, but the rule came from the foreman and it was in writing. I told him it was between him and Dale. I wasn't in that chain. Phil went to Dale. Dale told him the lot fell under the site lease and the rule applied. Phil pushed back. Dale told him if his crew didn't like it, they could take it up with Pinnacle HR. Phil called Pinnacle's subcontractor liaison that afternoon. Her name was Deborah. Sharp, no nonsense, good at her job. She called me for context the same day. I walked her through the history. Told her I had flagged it in writing to Dale on day 1. She went quiet. Then she said, "Why didn't you escalate this earlier?" I told her Dale is the foreman and I followed his directive. I flagged the risk. The flag was rejected. I documented what happened next. Another pause. Then she said, "Send me what you have." I sent her the original email chain, my flag, Dale's rule stands response, and the first 2 weeks of log entries. She called back 30 minutes later and said she was going to monitor the situation. I put the call in the log and kept working. Thursday of week 2 was the first day with a real dollar number attached. January 30th. 1:15 in the afternoon. I was on the third floor doing a walkthrough when I noticed the drywall work looked wrong. Corner beads were misaligned across about 22 linear feet of wall. This wasn't structural, but it was a cosmetic defect that needed to be torn out and redone. On a commercial build, interior finishes get inspected. They get flagged by the developer's team, they matter. I talked to the Redline Interiors crew lead, a guy named Antonio. He told me his guys had eaten nothing since 6 in the morning. Nobody had packed food, and the rule meant they couldn't get anything. Steady hands and a focused brain are not optional when you're doing tape, mud, and corner bead work. His crew didn't have either. I put it in the log. 22 linear feet of defective finish work. Estimated rework cost at Redline's billing rate, $1,400. First hard number I could attach directly to Dale's rule. Friday of week 2, I pulled the full 2-week output numbers. The productivity dip had grown from 6% to 9% across 2 separate work packages. 9% sustained over the remaining 6 weeks to completion would put us 3 to 4 days behind schedule. 3 to 4 days late on a commercial construction project is not a rounding error. The Harlow Block developer, a firm called Westgate Properties, had a liquidated damages clause in their contract with Pinnacle, $4,500 per day for late delivery. 3 days late, $13,500. 4 days late, $18,000. I wrote the projection out in the log with the math shown line by line. Saved it. Said nothing to Dale. He hadn't asked for a schedule update and I wasn't going to volunteer one. Not yet. Week 3 is when the situation went from bad to genuinely serious. Monday, February 3rd, RD. I got a call from the Pinnacle project manager at the main office, a man named Robert Hendricks. Robert was Dale's boss, essentially. He oversaw multiple sites and managed the higher-level client relationships. He was calling because the Westgate Properties project liaison, a woman named Carol, had reached out to him over the weekend. Carol had been doing her own informal tracking based on weekly progress photos. She'd noticed the pace of interior finishing had slowed over the previous 2 weeks, and she wanted to know if the March completion date was at risk. Robert was calm but direct. He asked me what was going on. I told him. The lunch rule, when it was implemented, what I had flagged, what I had observed, and what my schedule projections showed. I told him I had everything documented. He went quiet. Then he said Dale implemented a no-departure rule and there's no food on site. I said correct. He said, and you flagged it. I said, in writing. I have the emails. He said, send me everything. I sent him the full folder, the original announcement email from Dale, my flag email. Dale's rule stands response. 22 days of log entries. The $1,400 drywall rework cost item. The schedule impact analysis with the liquidated damages math. Robert called back 40 minutes later. He said he was going to make some calls and he'd be on site the next day. Then he asked me one question. Marcus, in the meantime, does the rule need to continue? I said Dale hasn't rescinded it. Robert said, I understand, I'll handle it. Tuesday morning, Robert showed up at 8 a.m. He went straight to Dale's site office, a portable unit near the main entrance. I was doing my morning walkthrough and I could see them through the window. I didn't try to hear what was being said. Robert came to find me at 8:45. He told me the lunch rule was suspended effective immediately and that Dale would announce it at the morning safety briefing. I asked if there was anything Robert needed from me. He said he needed me on a call at 3 p.m. with Pinnacle's VP of Operations and someone from Westgate. At the morning briefing, Dale announced in a flat voice that the lunch departure restriction was lifted. No explanation. He didn't look at anyone. 2 guys in the back actually started clapping, then caught themselves. Eddie from the framing crew caught my eye across the group. I didn't react. At 3 p.m., I dialed into the conference call. Robert was on. The Pinnacle VP of Operations, a man named Brian Farlow, was on. Carol from Westgate was on. And a Westgate project attorney was on, which told me this had already gone well past a casual check-in. Brian opened by saying Pinnacle was aware of a site management decision that had affected progress over the previous 3 weeks, and they were prepared to address it directly. He asked me to summarize what I had observed and documented. I walked them through it, clean and factual. The rule, the date, the flag, the documented response, the daily log, the cost items. $1,400 in drywall rework. Schedule projection showing 3 to 4 days of slippage. $13,500 to $18,000 in liquidated damages exposure if we didn't recover. When I finished, nobody spoke for a moment. Carol said, "You flagged this on day 1. I said, "Yes." She said, "And the foreman overruled you in writing." I said, "Yes, and that I had the email." Brian asked me to confirm the documentation had been shared with Robert. I confirmed. The Westgate attorney asked one question. Was there any on-site food provision at any point during the 3-week restriction period? I said no. The attorney said, "Thank you." That was my part of the call. Brian thanked me and asked me to drop off so they could discuss internal matters. I went back to my site walkthrough. Here is what happened after. Dale Pruitt was removed from the Harlow block 3 days later. Robert told me directly. Dale was reassigned to a small commercial tenant fit-out across town. About 1/15 the size of the Harlow block. No crew, no subcontractors to manage. Basically a glorified inspection role. His title stayed the same on paper. Everyone at Pinnacle knew what a reassignment like that meant. Pinnacle brought in a replacement foreman named Terrence within 48 hours. He was good, quiet, experienced, listened before he talked. On his first day, he asked me to walk him through the schedule and the open risk items. We spent 2 hours going through my project log together. He didn't say anything dramatic about the Dale situation. He just said, "Okay, what do we need to do to recover?" I had a recovery plan ready. I'd been building it in my head for about a week. The plan brought in a 4-person supplemental drywall crew from a secondary sub for 3 weeks to work in parallel on floors 2 and 3, $11,200 for the engagement. It also extended the daily work window by 45 minutes on Tuesdays and Thursdays. The existing crews agreed to it at straight time because they actually wanted the hours. Additional labor cost across the remaining weeks, roughly $6,800. Total recovery spend, approximately $18,000. The 3rd floor drywall rework, once the Red Line crew went back and fully assessed the damage, came in at $1,600, slightly above my initial estimate. Total direct cost attributable to Dale's 3-week lunch rule, approximately $19,600 between the rework and the recovery labor. Westgate's attorney sent Pinnacle a formal letter documenting that figure and requesting a credit against the final invoice. Robert told me Pinnacle accepted it without dispute. Because what were they going to argue? My documentation was airtight. Pinnacle credited Westgate $19,600. We completed the project on time. We hit the March date, no liquidated damages. Brian Farlow called me personally the day after the certificate of occupancy was issued. He said 2 things. First, that my documentation practice on this project was exemplary, and he wanted it to become standard across all Pinnacle sites. He asked if I'd put together a protocol document. I said yes. Second, he said there was a senior project coordinator role opening at the main office and asked if I was interested. I said yes to that too. I'll be straight with you about one thing. Not everyone saw it the way I did. About a week after the rule was lifted, Eddie, the framing crew lead, pulled me aside and said, "You knew that rule was going to hurt people. Why didn't you fight harder?" I understood why he felt that way. His crew had 3 miserable weeks, hungry, cold, frustrated, and their paychecks didn't reflect any of it. I told him the truth. I flagged it to Dale on day 1. Dale shut it down. If I go around a foreman on a judgment call about a site rule, I'm undermining the supervisory structure, and I become the problem. What I can do is document it and let it land where it lands. Eddie didn't love that answer. I get it. But here's the thing about a Dale Pruitt situation. Someone in authority using that authority for something dumb and harmful. In my experience, the fastest and most durable way to resolve it is to comply, document, and let the consequences speak for themselves. Going around Dale would have meant a confrontation, Dale digging in harder, and possibly me getting flagged as a difficult employee. Following the rule and logging every consequence meant that when the time came, I had 22 days of evidence and nobody could argue with a single line of it. The documentation wasn't just paperwork. The documentation was the whole point. Dale had chances to stop this. Day 1 when I flagged it. He could have said, "Good point, let me think." He could have set up a basic food option, even just a cooler with sandwiches. He could have walked the rule back on day 5 when the crew started complaining. He could have reconsidered in week 2 when Phil from Belmont called Deborah. He didn't. Every single time he had an off-ramp, he chose to dig in instead. And that's the thing about rules that exist purely to prove you're in charge. They don't come with a built-in way to reverse them, because the moment you walk them back, you've admitted you were wrong. Dale could not do that. For Dale, being wrong was more threatening than the consequences of staying wrong. So I let him be right. For 3 weeks, I let him be completely, thoroughly, expensively right. And then I sent Robert Hendricks a folder. The Harlow block delivered on time. Westgate signed 2 more projects with Pinnacle over the following year. I worked on both of them. No issues with the lunch break on either one. I moved into the main office role in April. $14,000 salary increase. The ability to set site protocols across all of Pinnacle's active projects. The documentation protocol I wrote for Brian became a standard onboarding document. Every new project coordinator at Pinnacle gets a copy now. 7 pages. Page 1. How to flag a site risk in writing. Page 2. How to create and maintain a daily log. I named it the Harlow Block Protocol. Nobody asked why. I didn't explain. I still have the original Word document. 43 entries over 22 working days. I go back and read it sometimes. Not because I'm bitter about any of it. I genuinely am not. But because it reminds me that patience and documentation together are a combination that's almost impossible to beat. So here's what I want to know from you. If you'd been in my position, would you have escalated earlier and gone over Dale's head before you had the receipts? Or would you have done exactly what I did and waited for the evidence to do the work? Drop your answer in the comments.